information and knowledge and experience with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I signed on in enough time to get nervous. I should have just come at the last minute, but then seeing you all, I was like, it's that thing that's happening. Good thing I have on my comfy pants still, right? All right, so yeah, as Graciela said, I run an organization called A Queer Endeavor, and we're out of the School of Education at CU Boulder. Did you all get the slides that I sent? Okay, cool. So I will be just telling you which slide I'm on rather than showing the slides so we can see each other. So A Queer Endeavor has been a two-person organization. My colleague and partner, Sarah, it's A Queer Endeavor. She's also my wife. We started this in 2014, and finally we have enough funding to grow our team this year. So we're super excited. Brittany Laura Hernandez will be joining us. And as Graciela said, we're an organization that works in partnerships with university-based teacher education programs and school communities to support educators to learn about gender, sexual, and family diversity. I'm excited to be here. This is so awesome that y'all are doing this as redesigning your syllabus for inclusive excellence. I want to push on a little bit the idea of inclusive excellence and queer it up a little bit, since I think there are lots of conversations about inclusive excellence without us really sort of critiquing inclusivity to begin with. And so I want to kind of think about that together as we move forward today. All right, so I'm going to move to slide 2 with this beautiful word, queer. I'm going to offer a queer lens and approach to this facilitation. So I want to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. As the title of our initiative suggests, queer thinking is pretty central to our work as a queer endeavor. But one of the first questions that we typically get asked in our facilitations, especially as you can imagine in K-12 contexts, is like, can we say that word? Like, this is supposed to be a bad word. What does it mean? And so we like to break down queer in 2 ways. And if you move to slide 3, I'll talk about that first way. So you can think of queer as an adjective and as a noun. When you're using queer in this way, you're usually referring to or describing people, and that's really important. It's about identity. And so queer as an adjective describes a person whose sexual orientation is not heterosexual and or whose gender identity is not cisgender. And then as a noun, a person who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or otherwise not heterosexual, a person whose gender identity is non-binary or differs in some way from the sex that they were assigned or identified as having at birth. Not all people in the LGBTQ community identify as queer. A lot of young folks do. And so one thing that we say to educators across the board is that it's really important that we let folks name and identify themselves. I think Christopher put in the chat somewhere around the attack on transness, and there's a big attack on queerness, and just the word queer is a lightning rod. And we actually have districts who say, can you just not use the word queer? Our whole team identifies as queer. And so it's like, showing up in that space to say this is actually an important part of who we are is really crucial. If you go to the next slide, slide 4, we also use queer as a verb. And to queer something means to question what counts as normal or common sense. So thinking about the schools that we teach in and work in, the classrooms that we organize and co-create with our students, what counts as normal there? And how do those versions of normal come to be? Where do we learn them? How do we learn them? How do they operate? And who do those norms work well for and privilege and make school a pretty spectacular place to be? And then who do they maybe marginalize, silence, and exclude? And so in the context of a queer endeavors work, we question what counts as normal or even appropriate to talk about in schools, what families and relationships look like, what's possible in terms of how our students identify and who they might become. So bringing a queer approach means that we're not, and this is where I'm kind of getting at this idea of inclusive excellence and questioning it, right? Because we don't want to just keep including. We can't include everyone. And so instead, we want to sort of question normativity at its roots. We question what counts as normal with respect to gender and sexuality, but also, as the students were saying earlier, race, language, ability, body type, the way people speak, We've learned that the common sense of language is standard American English, but we know that there's a lot of brilliance in many different dialects in the US. And so it's pushing on all those norms. And I think in this historical moment of post-pandemic teaching and learning, resisting what counts as normal feels extra important. Is that making sense? Cool. I'm not an overachiever typically, but as you can see in the amount of slides I have for 45 minutes, I was like really going for it in the overachievement department. So if I'm going too fast or if you have questions, you actually can just unmute and just interrupt me. Like, this is cool. It's a small group. So let's just be here together and do what we need to do with each other. All right, moving to the next slide. Slide 5. So we know that historically, as I said, institutions of education have been biased toward particular kinds of learners and particular ideas about what's normal. And so today, and in thinking about your syllabus, again, we want to move beyond like, who else should I include and how should I include them? We want to think about how taken for granted norms and assumptions about gender and sexuality tend to silence and isolate students who identify as LGBTQ. And we'll engage in critical self-reflection and dialogue around the question of what counts as normal. And importantly, we'll dig into what we're all doing, knowingly and unknowingly, to reinforce certain norms, assumptions, practices that impact the lived experiences of our students. We foreground gender and sexual diversity in our work because there's been such a pervasive silence around queer identities and conversations about education. But we know, again, that working toward liberation requires that we look through an intersectional lens and that we take seriously the ways that we all reinforce norms along lines of race, ethnicity, ability, language, and many other constructs. And so, in other words, we're all implicated here. And so we want to hold that as we learn together today. And we'll land on some strategies or promising practices. My goal is to engage you more in a framework for thinking toward action as you reconceptualize your syllabus. When I spoke with Graciela and Ellen, it's like some of the things that people want are like, what are the best practices? What do I do? And I'll talk about that in a minute, but you could Google that. There are people who write about that. Do this, do that. I think what we want to create here and cultivate together is this framework of like, why would I do that in the first place? Where am I coming from? How do I ground so that I know that whatever happens in my classroom, my response is coming from a grounded place and thinking toward or through a particular framework. Okay, next slide. I'm not just going to talk at you the whole time. I'm trying to get to the goods here. All right, so slide 6. What I've learned is that doing this sort of work in community can be emotional, it can be personal, it's vulnerable, and part of what makes this work around equity and justice conversations hard is that we all come to it differently. And we want to acknowledge that in our facilitations. Some folks in this space might be newer to conversations about gender and sexual diversity, and sometimes even the language itself is hard to wrap our heads around. And with that, there's a certain awkwardness to engaging in conversation, maybe fear of saying the wrong thing. If you're here, I invite you to lean into what might feel like some discomfort, and I'll do my best and challenge the rest of the group to do our best to hold what we call a soft space of accountability for us all to land in. Others of us have been here quite a bit because we embody identities that are typically central to diversity conversations. We are your queer colleagues, your colleagues of color, your colleagues who have disabilities, both seen and unseen. And there's power in having those lived experiences. There's an embodied knowledge there, but there's also vulnerability. And so we want to name that too. Conversations around equity, justice, and identity land on different bodies in different ways. And that's really part of the puzzle of this work. We're all positioned differently, and so are our students with respect to the various identities that we embody. And it's so, so crucial to acknowledge that. And last, some of you are immersed in this work on your campus already, in your classrooms. You're well-versed in the language and lingo of gender and sexual diversity, fly around campus with your rainbow capes on, making sure, looking for hot spots. I know you, see you. If you're that person, show up like that, right? To the conversation. Like, I know some stuff, I've done some stuff. But if you sit in this room today or in this whole institute and you're like, yeah, and you walk away thinking, look at me, look at all I know. you haven't learned anything, right? And so look for those places where you can go to stretch and grow and feel that discomfort. That's what we want to crave here, as our colleague Kevin Kumashiro says. And so what we really want to do is create a space together that involves all of us, as Adrienne Marie Brown says, being committed to and involved in our own and each other's transformation, because we all have work to do. And so given the ways that we show up differently, a question that we often lead with asks folks to reflect on how they are showing up to the conversation, and also to consider what's in the space, how your colleagues might answer the same question. And what we've learned in facilitating conversations like this one with over 9,000 educators up to this point is that digging in here is crucial. It actually is content. Some folks, again, want to just jump to action steps. They're like, tell me what to do. Tell me how to change my syllabus. Give me an article to use. But what we've learned is, and what we would like to remind folks of, is that a step toward any positive social change involves starting with ourselves. So confronting the assumptions, biases, vulnerabilities that we bring to this conversation, and also listening to what other folks in the room are bringing. And so we love this quote by Gloria Anzaldúa because she captures it so beautifully. She says, "The struggle is inner. The struggle has always been inner and is played out in outer terrains. Awareness of our situation must come before inner changes, which in turn come before changes in society. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads." So conversations about equity, identity, and diversity are rarely easy. And those conversations, that involve a critique of our own practices and our own syllabi are actually really tender to engage in. And so we'd like to name that. And so if you move to the next slide, I want to throw out some questions for you to silently reflect on, and we'll do them one at a time, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about these. So as you prepare to engage in today's session and maybe tender session, what will a conversation or a discussion about gender and sexuality and the learning I still have to do potentially bring up for you? Take a moment to check in what's going on in your body right now and just quietly reflect on that for about 30 seconds. Now think about a vulnerability that you're holding, something that could limit your ability or your willingness to participate wholeheartedly in this conversation. And now think about a strength that you bring that will help you engage openly and honestly. And then last, think about a vulnerability, the vulnerabilities and strengths that others in the space might be bringing. And so given my over preparation for this short session, a lot of today we're going to do in the chat. And I hope that's okay. And it's a small group, so we can still talk together as a whole group. But what I want you to do is to, in the chat, label V vulnerability, S strength. What are you bringing? But before you do, I just want to, this is how, as a queer endeavor, a lot of times in these conversations, people go over these like norms, classroom norms, you do it in your class, and then you go over them and everybody's doing the Zoom nod. And then as soon as you're done with those norms and you start talking, they're like out the door, right? They're generic. We've gone over them 100 times. I'm going to roll my eyes when somebody says something that's not woke. That's not the work that we're trying to do here. And so the way that we norm the space is through this activity. What matters right now isn't just generally how to have these conversations. You matter. There are 16 people in this space, and we all bring unique experiences and identities to this particular space right now. And so as people put their vulnerabilities and strengths in the chat, hold those. Right? This is who you're in the room with to have this conversation. And so let's just take a few minutes, recognize who's in the space, what are you bringing, V, vulnerability, S, strength, and then what others might be bringing. Will take about 2 minutes. So just get started on that. Contribute to the chat. About 30 seconds. Make sure you're reading what your colleagues have written. Okay, thank you. And Rachel, by the way, I do this work every day and my knowledge is probably out of date too, compared to what students are cooking up these days. And so I think that's one thing to remember is that I want to say naturally, even though that's kind of counter to queerness, but I feel like naturally, this is going to continue to change because it's not fixed, it's not binary. And so we welcome that. Any out loud reflections of what you're seeing in the chat? I think one of the things that has been and become more and more important to us as an organization is the actual community that we build to do this work together. And so are there any reflections about what you're reading or what you're bringing that you want to share out loud before we roll on? Anything coming up for you?
As a cisgender heterosexual, not always thinking about queer identities, and I guess the fear of saying something wrong, offending, And then I saw a comment about, also having a parent hat on. So there are also times when working with students, I think in terms of how would I want someone to treat my child?
Yeah, thank you. I know one of the superintendents here, she says to her teachers, she's like, we don't want, like, the whole idea around tolerance. And she says, if I had to drop my kid off to be tolerated for 40 hours a week, I wouldn't drop my kid off. Right. So thank you for that. Any other comments or reflections that you want to voice into the whole space?
I'm just really appreciating the container you're building for us to have this conversation, and noticing the ways that that can be possible on Zoom. So appreciating the boundaries and the connections that are making that possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I can't believe so I know we started late, so can you put when I need to stop the time in the chat so I don't go on and on, because I'm so excited to be here. Woo, in this small group and people who are committed to this work. It's so exciting. So thank you for having me and for these comments. I think, sometimes it's like, I teach classes on campus it's like social foundations classes, and they're about racism and, gender inequity and all the things. And some of the graduate students who teach in the program are like, God, these students, like, they just don't, they don't get it. And it's like, well, no, that's why we have this class, And so recognizing that, none of us got this, this experience, and like, people come to campus and they don't know these things, and so this is like so important, the container, right? We want people to feel uncomfortable. That's what learning is, right? But we can't just make them feel uncomfortable in a toxic space. So how do we do this together, right? So thank you for that. All right, I'll move on. So okay, so the next slide, let's see, slide 8. Andrea Gibson. Anybody know who Andrea is? Yay. All right. So Andrea is actually a good friend of mine. They are the godparent of our kid, and lucky they've stolen a lot of my poetry lines and became famous. So at times, conversations about equity, diversity, and human rights are hidden in discourse about issues. Right. So it's like the issue of immigration, the pronoun issue, or the bathroom issue. And what happens when we keep those conversations at the level of issues is that we forget, or sometimes refuse to acknowledge, that those issues actually affect real people. Right. And I'm thinking of one of the comments in the strengths and vulnerabilities, like, how do we engage regressive ideas? And a lot of times those ideas are rooted in this conversation about an issue. Right. And so when we keep the conversation at the at that level, we create space for debate, or for the belief that the identities of people and their rights are actually debatable. And so in the spirit of framing LGBTQ topics as things we live and experience rather than issues, I'm going to ask you all, we're going to engage with a poem by Andrea Gibson called Your Life. Andrea is a Colorado-based genderqueer spoken word artist who writes about a lot of things, but specifically about gender and sexuality. And as you listen and watch, I want to encourage you to locate yourselves in this poem and what you can relate to, or what makes sense, and also maybe what you can't relate to, or what doesn't make sense at all to you. So I'm going to share my screen and play the poem and hope that it all goes well for us. Oh, can I get permission to share the screen?
Sorry about that. I think you have it now. I thought you had it. Letting you.
Let's see. All right, I got it. Can you see that?
It isn't that you don't like boys. It's that you only like boys you want to be. David, with his jaw carved out of the side of a cliff. Malcolm, who doesn't have secrets, just stories he owes no one. Chris, the basketball hero with a tick, blinks 15 times when he makes a shot. You spend hours blinking in the mirror, pretending you're a star like him. Mary Levine calls you a dyke, and you don't have the language to tell her she's wrong and right. So you just show up to her house, promising to paint your fingernails red with what will gush from her busted face if she ever says it again. You're in the 7th grade. You don't even know you want a girlfriend. You still believe too much in the people who believe in Jesus to even feel that desire through its health threat. You just want to kick your desk on the way to the principal's office, slouch in detention, want to cut your hair and spit out whatever you don't want in your mouth, your own name even, skirting around the truth. You don't yet know the boys are building their confidence on stolen land, but you do worry the girls might be occupied with things you will never understand, won't ever be good at. You take one pretty step and feel like you're pouring bubbles into your own bloodbath. You don't want a soft death. You want a hard life that is your life. Your life in the locker room that doesn't stop demanding you keep your eyes on the floor. Your life at the prom while you run home in a snowstorm, chucking your last pair of heels in a snowbank, realizing you are the only boy you ever wanted to tear your dress off for. Your life, the first Christmas you spend alone, the years you learn to build your family out of scratch. Your life, when someone drags you from a restroom by the color of your coat. Your life, every time airport security screams pink or blue, trying to figure out what machine setting to run you through, choosing your life and how that made you into someone who now often finds it easy to explain your gender by saying you are happiest on the road when you're not here or there, but in between, that yellow line running down the center of it all like a goddamn sunbeam. Your name is not a song you will sing under your breath. Your pronouns haven't even been invented yet. You're gonna shave your head and drive through Texas. You're gonna kill your own God so you can fall in love for the first time. They're gonna keep telling you your heartbeat is a pre-existing condition. They're gonna keep telling you you are a crime of nature. And you're gonna look at all your options and choose conviction, choose to carve your own heart out of the side of a cliff, choose to spend your whole life telling secrets you owe no one to everyone, till there isn't anyone who can insult you by calling you what you are, you holy blinking star, you highway streak of light, falling over and over for your hard life, your perfect life, your sweet and beautiful life.
Okay. So let's spend a couple minutes on slide 9, just on your own, reflecting on these questions. What counts as normal in your life, in the different social worlds you move in and out of? What counts as normal with respect to your
Betsy, we're having a little trouble, or I'm having a little trouble hearing you now. I wonder if your sound is still linked to the video.
Is that better?
It's still a little quiet.
Huh. Still?
Now you're back. Yep.
Oh. Okay, so let's spend a couple minutes just reflecting quietly on these questions on slide 9. So what counts as normal in your life, in the different social worlds you move in and out of, and with respect to your identities and their intersections? Where did you learn the language of who you were becoming? So in other words, how did you see yourself, reflected or not, in your K-12 education, university experience? And then we'll spend time out loud talking about what this poem brings up for you as you think about the different students in your courses, in your syllabus, your classroom norms and practices. Sometimes when I ask these questions to students, they'll say, you know, race didn't really come up in school. And it's important, I think, to remind people that if one aspect of your identity doesn't seem to come up, then it comes up all the time in a way that is super privileged, right? You don't have to have a hard time for your identity to come up. So take a couple minutes to think about these questions, and then we'll talk as a whole group. Maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, let's come back together as a whole group and maybe land on that final question and just spend a couple minutes here. What did the poem, the voices, all the different stories that existed in that piece, what did they bring up for you as you think about your students, your syllabus, classroom norms and practices? If you want to share out loud or in the chat.
For me, and I've shared this before in this workshop, there's so much that I do with younger students in sharing children's literature. And I find that's a great way to have so many different types of conversations. And it also makes me think about how much I don't do, but will do as I teach a course on literacy, and just bringing in all those examples that I've used with students to talk about various identities.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of times we hear like, how is this appropriate for elementary? And so we're teaching our, teacher education students, but we are also teaching them to go into the field and do this stuff, right? That's our and I think what people don't realize is that we are already talking about gender and sexuality all the time in elementary school. It just does, it's not tagged as such until it's queer, right? It's like when we talk about a family with two moms, it's all about sex, you know, and we make this joke, Sarah and I, because we have a kid, and I'm like, you know, we're probably the only family that you can read about because no sex happened to have our kid, right? And so people don't realize that, like, and then the norm, you know, thinking about like, you know, telling teachers, hey, like, you know, thanks for doing a great job. You know, when you read the story about the mom and the dad, send my kid to the library because we don't talk about that in my house. I mean, that's what this is, right? It's bananas, how people don't realize that we're already doing this, right? But queerness has been cast as this like, you know, it's hypersexualized. So.
I want to add to that something that, again, I did this journey with my own kids, and when talking with teachers in elementary schools, they also said, we don't talk about sexuality here or sex. I said, you all knew that, using my daughter's friends, that Ali had a boyfriend in 3rd grade, and you all celebrated that. Right. And you all knew that then she had a crush on everyone. It was common knowledge who had crushes on whom. Right. Since kindergarten or preschool, right. We talk about boyfriends and girlfriends. But it wasn't until a child said, I have a crush on someone of the same gender, that it became problematic.
Right. And it's interesting too that people, they'll say, don't you think they're too young to know? You know, and then it's like, well, you didn't think they were too young to know when she had a crush on him. But now that she has a crush on her, all of a sudden it's like, she can't possibly know, you know? And so these are, this is what you know, the whole what counts as normal and common sense. It's beyond inclusion, right? It's recognizing all the little things that we do to contribute to normativity. And again, along multiple and intersecting lines. And so I'm going to move us along just because this is like, you know, when you try to get a new therapist and you have like 15 minutes to like interview them. That's what I feel like this is like right now. I'm doing my best. All right. So some questions to take with you. And, you know, I'll quickly just read through these because again, this work to me is not about different things I can tell you to do. It's about process. How do I get you, not me, but like, how do we start thinking together so that I don't need the checklist of things to do? I'm reacting and responding from a particular place. And so how do we recognize and stay open and lean into discomfort and vulnerability about what we don't know about the lived experiences of students? What happens when we have to learn and also unlearn what we've taken for granted as normal or the way things are? And what happens when we actually center the voices of folks who have historically been on the margins of our campus and our classrooms? How can we continuously question the ways that our classrooms don't make space for those voices? And of course, you know, what is the learning doing to us? And that's a big question that queer pedagogy asks. It says, like, again, if you sit through a session and learning, you didn't feel anything, then maybe you didn't learn, right? Learning is going to do something. And so recognizing that when you ask students in your classroom to start turning the wheel back and to start unlearning some things, there's some discomfort. And so what kind of container will you co-create with them? And also, you know, a lot of times I'll bring up with them, you know, Kumashiro talks about how we experience crisis, right? And this discomfort. And I've found that if you name that with them in these conversations about race, about ability, they're like, oh, this is like, well, normal that I'm feeling this discomfort, and they'll talk about crisis throughout the semester. And so giving them that frame to understand some of the things that they are feeling is super helpful for them. I'm not going to go through slides 11 and 12, but I did want to just give you like a sort of snapshot or some of the themes that are in the literature around LGBTQ plus people on campus and specifically in classrooms. These data are specifically focused on classrooms for a couple of reasons. One is the obvious one, is that, you know, you can respond to these trends through your syllabus and your curriculum. And another is oftentimes support for queer students in higher education stay at the level of policy. And that focus limits a deep understanding of the lived experiences of students, and it also fails to transform institutions. Policies are important, but I'm a fan of Dean Spade's work and other people who talk about policy as maybe a distraction, something to keep the norm in place. And so it's important to sort of question what policy has to say about itself to begin with. And so not relying on policies, but again, thinking about how we can reflect some of this work through our practices is also important. And so you can take a look at those later on. I wanted to, on slide 13, based on those trends, what questions come up for you? And this is something maybe you take into the syllabus workshop, looking at those trends. And I don't think any of the data will be surprising. It's kind of like, the general narrative about queer folks in general is that we have a hard time, but it's not because we're queer, it's because we live in a very straight cisgender world that says no, 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 all the time through a variety of ways, including silence. And so when you get into the curriculum or the syllabus workshop, maybe draw some questions from those themes. Like, what questions are you sitting with as they relate to your practice, and maybe grapple with those together as you move forward. Slide 14. So just turning to the root of those troubling trends, right? As I've mentioned, it's so crucial that we think about how discriminatory and exclusionary practices operate within systems. So in other words, we have to think beyond individual attitudes and beliefs and how those impact queer students. And this means looking beyond individual examples of hatred toward LGBTQ people and harassment, and really consider how normative practices across campus accumulate to systematically marginalize a variety of groups of people. So I want to briefly just talk about these two systems and what I mean by, or what, cis-heteronormativity. So heteronormativity refers to a pervasive belief system that assumes everyone, I'm sorry, Fran.
You are not alone.
I mean, who knocks on a door anymore? Somebody right now. So heteronormativity refers to a pervasive belief system that assumes everyone is straight, that straight is normal, that anything outside of those norms is considered abnormal, weird, deviant. And then cis-normativity, a companion belief system, because we've done such a good job of conflating sexuality and gender, refers to another dominant belief system that assumes everyone is cisgender, meaning our gender identities line up with the sex we were assigned at birth. It also perpetuates the belief that cisgender is the only normal and natural gender identity, and that anything that deviates from the norm, including trans and non-binary identities, are unnatural and abnormal. And so in schools, these interlocking systems are pervasive. They operate all around us, and often, like Beverly Tatum says about racism, it's kind of just smog in the air. It's just considered the status quo or the way things are, and we don't really question that. But these belief systems send strong messages about what counts as normal with respect to families, relationships, gender, and gender roles. And research shows that these messages are institutionalized in school through policies, curriculum, the stories we read, the language we use, and through our teaching practices. And earlier in the chat, somebody said, it's interesting, like, I don't mean to bring up cisgender people, but these are actually things that affect all of us. And yeah, that's true, right? This is unbelievable, by the way. So yeah, this is welcome to my world. So take a couple of minutes, or take a minute to look at slides 15 and 16 while I go try to see what's happening at my door. Hopefully I won a big prize, and that's why somebody won't go away. 15 and 16 for a minute, and then I'll be right back. All right. Whew. In case anybody's wondering, that was Summit Tree Care. We've been calling them for, I don't know, like 3 months to come out, and they're out right now. So I'm gonna go to slide 17. You can dock my pay for that break, by the way.
Kathy, we run a little bit late all the time, so take a deep breath. And if there's anything you want to highlight about 15 and 16, just go ahead and do it. Because that's a really great set of, it's a terrible set of things, but a really specific and thought-provoking set. So if you want to say something about that, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, the one that, and thanks for this, it just never ends. I think the one that Melissa put into the chat is one that comes up a lot. And I think, you know, what 15 and 16 bring up for me, it's like, I do these things. And whether or not I do it out loud, some of these things go through my head, you know? And so I think it's important to see how these systems materialize, and to recognize that we're all part of them, right? The system is not sitting out there on Broadway Street, you know, building itself. We're doing it all the time through the little things that we do. But I think that the one that Melissa put into the chat is so deep, because it's what that does, it's not only about grammar, but you're taking away somebody's identity. Like, and we say to people, you know, and it's hard. I mean, the three of us who run a queer endeavor, we were all English teachers, middle school and high school English teachers. We have like 30 years of experience between the three of us. And, you know, saying to English, like people will raise their hand and be like, well, I'm an English teacher. And we're like, all right, you know, and we can say, you know, this isn't about you. And it feels hard to say that, because we never come from a place of shame or anything like that, but really recognizing this isn't about you. Like, my pronouns are they, them. Feel that, practice it, you know? And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about lately is like, you know, doing the pronoun go around, memorizing certain things. You really have to understand that gender is a construct. You really do. And it's not just important, again, for trans people or non-binary people. If we really believe that gender was a construct, then I really don't know any of your pronouns. I don't care what you look like, but we have to embody that, right? And that's hard. I mean, I'm constantly boy, girl, and I do this work. I'm gay for pay, and that's what I do. And so it's really like turning that wheel back, right? And practicing with each other. All right, I'm going to go to slide 17, because I do want to leave you with some, I'll say, promising practices. So there are things that you can do, both big and small, that speak back to some of what those systems of cis-normativity deliver to us. You know, we think a lot about advocacy and being an ally, and we want to say that sometimes the advocacy work falls on the shoulders of queer folks and BIPOC folks. And so if you're a student ally, or if you're an ally to students in this space, or to your colleagues, accomplice, advocate, we want to invite you to think about how you might implement some of these practices so that the work doesn't always land on queer students and faculty, and really taking risks that don't implicate your identity in the same ways that queer folks might experience. And so an important step you can take is to create opportunities in the first little square up there for students to name and identify themselves. So never really calling roll, letting students have a chance to just tell you what their names are, introduce themselves, share the pronouns that they want to identify with, and also do the internal work you need to do to not make assumptions about people's identities based on their appearance, and sort of model that. You know, sometimes people will say, well, you know, it's obvious, you know, some undergrads would be like, man, things like that. And I think it's just kind of like, no, actually, I really don't know how you identify. And so I'd like for you to tell me. You can also add your pronouns to your email signature. And some of you, or maybe all of you, are already doing this to begin with. One way to start the pronoun conversation is just to always introduce yourselves with your pronouns in the beginning of a semester. And that can, especially in the younger grades, like telling your teacher ed students to do the same thing, because that becomes curriculum for students. Young ones will say, why did you just tell us that your pronouns are she? And it's like, well, because you never really know until somebody tells you, and that way you become the curriculum and not the student who wants to use they, them in the classroom. Keep calm and read the syllabus. As you know, the syllabus is an excellent place to start, which is why we're here. So signal to students on your syllabus that you know what's what. So beyond the typical non-discrimination and harassment statements that are pretty typical on campuses, include statements about how students' names and pronouns matter, letting students know that you want to honor their identities and that you're committed to doing that. You can also use the syllabus to include a statement about the ways that students' identities interact with classroom content and conversation, much like I did at the start of this conversation, explicitly recognizing that conversations will land differently on different bodies, and that the intention of our words is sometimes different from their impact, and that you're committed to co-creating a classroom of respect. And again, we call it a soft space of accountability. And what that means to us is that we recognize that everybody in the classroom is contributing to oppression in many forms, and we're all going to feel uncomfortable, and we're going to hold you accountable, but not ever with shame at the center. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot these days. That's a little disappointing. Making sure that the language you use to address students, just getting rid of gendered forms of address, sir, ma'am, ladies, gentlemen. Asking students how they want to be addressed, Mr., Mrs., Miss, or the gender neutral mix. You can do this by passing around note cards too, if people don't want to do it publicly. The one thing about pronouns though, is that they are public. We don't refer to people by, hey, gay, but you do say, she's over there, and so sharing pronouns is a way to make sure that the space is, we're addressing people in the correct ways. Yeah. Zara.
I teach at a Quaker school. And one thing that we do is, in general, address people as friends. But also if it's math class, mathematicians, scientists, writers, readers. And this way we take, gender out of it. So,
Yeah, and thinking about who do we want students to become? Do we want them to become just their genders? We want them to become all the things that you just said. And so maybe that is at the root of what we address, how we address our students. Let's see, making sure that your syllabus includes LGBTQ plus people, that we, but in a way that's not deficit oriented, in a way that's complex. White, cisgender gay men have a different experience than trans women of color who are living in poverty, right? And so making sure that your students know that we're not just this, group of people that all agree with each other, have the same experiences. We're complex and we disagree with each other and we fight for different things. And so making sure that that's part of the conversation as well. The safe zone, these have become a bit of a symbolic gesture. And so now they're everywhere. And so what students have told us is to tell professors and teachers in K-12, please don't hang one unless you make the safe zone an action. And so that means talking about it, right? Why are those the things on the sign? Why is that the list? Why isn't it other things? And so this could be it could be a whole semester of study, why the safe zone sign came to be, why it's necessary. And so just complicating it and making sure that it's something that you actually address in your classes if you have one in your office. And then the last thing, addressing mistakes. If you use, someone's wrong pronouns, correct yourself. Going on as if it didn't happen is actually less respectful than making the correction. This also saves the person who was misidentified from having to correct an incorrect pronoun. And so, you know, just addressing mistakes. And again, that's something in the beginning of a semester that you can say, like, we're going to make mistakes with language. And we want to hold each other accountable and have this be an educative space without, you know, people in the room who know everything, making other people feel crummy. And so I'm going to, on slide 18, just encourage you to commit to a small step that you can take. And then really on slide 19, I think that's where I would encourage you to drop in your workshop, this framework for thinking toward action. So thinking about the internal work that you need to do, thinking about what counts as normal, moving beyond inclusion. What would it look like to question and challenge normativity across the board? So it's not just what's on your syllabus, it's how you teach, right? It's the questions you ask, it's how you engage students. And so thinking about the pedagogical responsibilities that come along with inclusion is important. What assumptions are embedded in course content? What would it look like to challenge those assumptions? How might you be reinforcing or perpetuating some stereotypes, some normative thinking? And then what might learning and unlearning do to you and to the students in your classroom, to their sense of self, and how do you support them through that process? I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I was trying.
We do.
Okay, so yeah, what's coming up? What are y'all sitting with? What's what over there?
And just so people know, we're taking a few minutes to have this be meaningful, and so that'll mean a little bit less time in breakout rooms, but this is all connected to the work of redesigning that we're doing. So
there was on one of the slides that was discussing what hetero and cis normativity look like, the statement when talking about LGBTQ issues, inserting "well, I'm straight but" or "but I'm not gay" as an example of that. And so I can recognize some of the inherent issues there, but I'm also wondering how, like, we negotiate that within an academic space, because oftentimes people like to address their positionality in framing the comments that they make, right? So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've never. Thanks for bringing that up. I think it's on the slide, meant to sort of say, well, I'm not gay, but you know, I still am an ally, kind of thing. But that, which is different from saying, as a straight, you know, cisgender person, here's my positionality. And so I think it's a little bit different, but thank you for calling out that, that distinction. I also have been thinking lately about just the way that we position ourselves. And, you know, when people say, like, they get up and they're like, well, as a straight white, blah, 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 I'm like kind of tired of it a little bit. And I know that's probably not a popular thing to say, but it's like, do something about it. You know, like, okay, so, you know, all my students these days are recognizing their privilege. And now, different from a few years ago, they're saying, like, I have a lot of privilege, and that's what they write about. And then I'm like, okay, wait, we're not doing this. We need to do this a little bit more complexly, because it's like, okay, you have all this privilege, but what are we doing to put our privilege on the line? And that's something that I've been asking myself. Like, as a white person, I can own my privilege, but it does not affect me on the daily. So what am I doing to put my privilege on the line? So that's just a little bit of, you know, just thinking about how we've been naming ourselves. I want to complicate that a little bit, which is not what you were talking about, but just something I've been thinking about.
you're reminding me of this great Bettina Love video where she's talking about what it means to be to go beyond being an ally to being a co-conspirator, or what's the other word she uses? Anyway, she's talking about the Black woman in South Carolina who climbed up a flagpole to take down the Confederate flag, and she's in this video clip, Bettina Love is sitting down, but she can't sit down any longer to tell the story. She's like, what it means to as you're saying, put your privilege on the line is like to be her white friend at the base of the flag, which she did have a white, who was standing between the police officer and the flag. Like, that's what we're talking about, because you can put your body on the line in a way that the person climbing up the flagpole can. And I always think of that, it's such a physical image of what it means to put your privilege on the line. So just an example that always gets me thinking about what would it mean to put our privilege on the line.
And this also is making me think, we are thinking about gender diversity today, about queerness, and also related to gender. How many times our male colleagues invalidate us as women. And I remember being in a meeting at the time when I was an administrator and trying to talk among all the deans, and there was one particular person that every time I was going to talk interrupted me and went first, even though, and there were two male colleagues who noted it and made eye contact with me and went like that. And after the meeting, I said, I needed more than that. I needed you to stop him and say, Graciela was trying to talk first. So that's an example that perhaps we relate more, those of us who are cisgender and heterosexual. But so that's what putting privilege in the line means. Saying, wait, Graciela has been trying to say something for a long time that Ellen is very good at doing in the chat. But generally, we don't really think about identities, right? What are the different identities that the person who is trying to talk is representing.
And then recognizing where that comes from. I think it's, the work is noticing behaviors, normative behaviors that we're just used to, but then also saying, this isn't a new thing that those two guys kept interrupting. This is a gendered thing. And so let's think together about how gender functions in our space. Who's in charge? Who's allowed to say things? Who knows stuff, right? Whose tone gets called out if it's to this, that, or the other? And that goes along multiple aspects of identity. And that I think takes a little bit more guts, right? To say, not just like, hey, she was talking, but like also that's so gendered. These are the systems that we're talking about. This is how the system is operating right here. What can we do about it, friends? Let's work together.
I know we need to end soon, but I just want to say that it feels like some of that kind of unspoken sexism feels like it's becoming more prominent right now to me. And in some ways, I think it's because we're trying to change systems. I'm just talking about higher ed right now, that I have felt it more in the last year than I have in the last 10 years. And I think in some ways it's connected to, like, we're trying to really change systems and upend what counts as knowledge and what counts as expertise. And like, if you became a professor, part of the reason you did is because like, it's about knowing things, right? And like, what we're saying is, we want you to have a learner-centered syllabus that isn't about what you know. We want you to be in meetings where everyone has a voice. And I think that's a different kind of threat to sort of traditional, not even traditional masculinity, even sort of more quote unquote progressive masculinity. So anyway, interesting that you bring that up, because I think it's churning right now. What does it mean for our male colleagues if what our job is as professors is fundamentally not about knowledge, ownership, and for all of us, what's that mean? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Zara, I saw your hand.
Just looking at the comment or the question about, putting your privilege on the line. Many times people will come for support. So I think one way to put your privilege on the line is to not make excuses for the person doing harm, especially with the comment of, I'm sure they didn't mean it, or they're a very good person, I know them so well, you know, they wouldn't say that normally. Like maybe they wouldn't say that to you, but they said that to me. And that person, knowing that it took a lot for that person to get up the courage to come to you, to share their story, and they trust you. So, you know, and they feel as though you have, you know, some privilege in whatever area that is to make a change. So just, you know, be as courageous as the person who came to you and do something about it.
Thank you for that, Zara. And maybe that's a good place for us to close this fantastically wonderful time with with Bethy. And I think it made it better that we got to walk through your house with your dog barking. So we're all about like vulnerability as a strength in creating classroom community, and you embrace that in such lovely ways. So
thank you so much for having me. This has been an awesome treat. Is it okay if I just drop our website into the chat for folks? Okay,
absolutely.
Please.
I'm gonna, thanks, y'all. This is our website, and then this we just did a huge summer institute, and we did it hybrid this time, and we had like over 500 educators, and so check it out. We'd love to, you know, next summer have you all join. So this has been awesome. It's a privilege to be here, and reach out anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bethy.
All right, take care. Good luck.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I also want to mention one thing that I did is that I took her questions that she ended with and put them on our Jamboard.
Oh, good idea.
So that when you're in your breakout groups, let me just show you. There are two places on the Jamboard. So this is our page of takeaways from today, first of all. So lots of great ones, and feel free to add there. And I had to include Gloria herself in all her glory. So this is Bethy's slide about things to consider in terms of taking action. And then the slide before it sort of goes back to the syllabus framework that we've been using as a structure and looks at some of the questions that might intersect with some of the conversation we're having today, like how will differences of positionality be handled in the classroom? How do you create safe and brave spaces for both visible and invisible forms of oppression? To what extent do teaching activities meet the needs of diverse learners, diverse learning styles, diverse ways of processing, performative styles, diverse genders, and then a little bit of a reconnection to that hot moments conversation we started on Monday. And I'm gonna put in the chat before we open the breakout rooms, the sort of framework for hot topics. Like sometimes when you're addressing sort of, I find when I've been addressing misgendering or some of the issues that have come up today, it becomes kind of a hot moment in the classroom. To what extent does the course material represent a variety of voices? And then what's your teaching philosophy, and how does the syllabus communicate this to students? And how do you do it in a way that avoids sort of biases that don't address the needs of all students, but particularly for today's topic, gender diverse students? So I would say choose a question or questions that you're wrestling with, spend some time thinking about what Bethy had to say today, and how, I think this is the time to really try to think about specific action steps you might want to take in your syllabus and course design. So if you can try to make that shift, that will be good. Graciela, anything else that you want to add there?
I was just responding to Michelle too late that we were going to email the exit ticket. She had to leave. Exit ticket and eval. We have been finding the feedback incredibly valuable and try to adjust to modify the next day based on that. Except for today, we went counter, but we trusted the group dynamic and the energy in terms of taking time away from the syllabus to really engage in this conversation. So we know we departed from the feedback we got, but we felt that it was important to honor the energy we were feeling in the group. So no, that's what it is. Let's try to see how we bring this into our syllabi and take notes, annotate whatever way you want, while it's fresh in your heart and your mind and your body. That's the idea, to make notes so then we can elaborate more. Glad you're enjoying it, Sarah. We are too.
My dog was barking. I muted myself. I'm going to open the rooms. We've been trying to have some commonality yes, and we'll make sure that those videos get shared. We're trying to have some commonality in the groups across, but we're not having the same people every day. So everyone has at least one other person who's partnering with them during this session, and use it the way you want. It could be some silent work time, it could be some collaborative work time. And I think we're going to try to come back in 30 minutes yes, Graciela?
And there are additional, we open some empty break rooms. So if you prefer to be in a space by yourself, just go into one of those break rooms.
Great. Great. See you in a half an hour.